I'm Stephen Alexander, Solutions Architect with AWS, and we're going to talk about ATO and security for the next hour. Does that sound exciting? Yeah? Sweet. All right, so this is kind of what we're going to talk about today. What is ATO? We're going to cover that real fast just for the purposes of this talk. And after that, we're going to talk about security and how is that a little bit different maybe than just getting ATO. By a quick show of hands, who here already has something that's ATO in AWS? So yeah, it's awesome. It's at least half of you. So hopefully you guys are already doing a lot of this stuff. If not, then you'll learn something today. So for today's talk, what is ATO? So generally when I talk about ATO with my customer base, it's something that's already in production. So we're not talking about tests, we're not talking about development. In the world I live in, that might be called IATT, or interim authority to test. ATO is what you get like after you've kind of gone through a RMF process or something to that effect, and you say, all right, great, we're ready to rock and roll, go into production, go live. It's usually related to a mission system or something to that effect. Does that seem fair? Right? So the first thing I like to think about when we think about security is the blast radius, right? And a lot of times when people are doing ATO, traditionally on-prem, and they do a great job about this even with stuff in the cloud, it's that operating system, it's the application, it's things of that nature, right? But we don't always understand, especially if you're first or somewhat new to AWS, somewhat new to moving to the cloud. It's a little bit different to start thinking about what is that actual blast radius in AWS. And that first one is the account itself. The AWS account is your first line. What we mean by here is you should have a multi-account strategy, right? I have had customers give ATO and they've had test, dev, and prod all in the same account. Or they may have even had multiple projects and multiple systems in the same account. And that's not really a best practice. That's not what we would say is the best way to go about doing that from a security perspective. As you can see here, some of the things that having multiple accounts will let you do is restrict that access to the account. If you're familiar with IAM, when you have an IAM user or IAM role, it's to the account itself, right? Not necessarily to the account, but only this VPC, or to the account, but only this DynamoDB or something like that, right? So multiple accounts is the way to go. So another thing is here, if that account happens to be compromised, if you put everything in one account and that account is compromised, then what's compromised? All the things, right? So that's not a great idea. Environment isolation is another good one. A lot of my customers have this kind of concern, or at least things that they think about. So multiple account is a great way to do that. Service limits. This is something that not a lot of people think about. But if you've been using AWS for a while, you've probably run into service limits, right? Like you try to launch so many EC2 instances and then you can't because of a service limit, or it could be all sorts of service limits that we have. Usually you can raise those with a ticket, but that's great. But if you have multiple systems using the same account, eventually you do probably hit a hard limit, we'll call it, right? Like there's a point in which you can't do more. One of those could be like VPC peering. VPC peering, you know, it's some number, something like 125 VPC peers before you can't do any more. So again, if you're doing multiple accounts, then you're not necessarily battling, you know, multiple projects aren't necessarily battling each other to get through those service limits. And another one is cost allocation and chargeback. That's not necessarily a security concern, but generally it is a project or a program concern. So here's an example of what a multiple account strategy might look like. One of the ones I want to point out here is that one in the middle. That's the shared services account. It is a nice way to not necessarily duplicate a lot of efforts, like if you're doing Nessus scans, right? You don't necessarily need a Nessus scan system in every account. You can do something with a shared account. Another one might be a GitHub or some other kind of repository for patching or other code repo that you might have. And then you might see over here, you have your application or prod account over there to your right. And over here to the left, you'll have that consolidated security account, right? So you can pull in all those CloudTrail logs and pull in all the other logs and then do a centralized place to do your analytics and such. By show of hands, are people fairly familiar with the multi-account strategy? Okay, so it's not everybody. It's not even half the people that showed hands, so hopefully we'll get the word out. The next level is, now that we kind of understand multi-account, would be understanding IAM. I've had some customers get fairly new to AWS perhaps, and what they do is they start using AWS, and early on, just a couple years ago, people were even sharing the root access, right? Which is crazy. I see you shaking your head. Yeah, that's totally nuts. But that's what people were doing. Next level would be like, hey, I'm going to use IAM users. But if you're using multiple accounts, what does that mean? Multiple IAM users, right? And if you're going to have multiple IAM users come with passwords. So, of course, you wouldn't use the same password, right? A whole bunch of times. But that's what people end up doing. So that's not great either. So really what you want to do is federate, set up some kind of federation model. So if you are doing multiple accounts, you have a federation service, you go to that federation service, and then you assume a role. And that's also more least privilege. If you're doing IAM user, and sometimes you have to do stuff with S3, and sometimes you have to do stuff with VPC, and sometimes you have to do stuff with EC2 or Dynamo or whatever, your policies associated to that user will be all of those things all the time, right? So with roles, you can be very specific and say, here's my role just to do IAM stuff. Here's my role just to do networking stuff, right? So that's a much better approach security-wise. And I've seen a number of customers give ATO, but they don't do roles. They don't do role-based access to the account, and they're not doing a federated approach that way. The other one would be MFA, or two-factor authentication. Hopefully, a lot of you guys already do MFA or TFA or to just your systems on the network or whatever, but you can also do that with AWS. So you probably want to look into that. Permission boundaries, by show of hands, who's familiar with permission boundaries? So I think this is one of our best kept secrets in a way. It's not really a secret, it's out there, but not a lot of folks know about it. Permission boundaries are fantastic because it can it's almost self-explanatory, I suppose, permission boundary, right? So it's going to say, you can't do more than this. It's sort of like a policy, a normal IAM policy, but it's sort of a higher level than that. So you can apply a permission boundary to some role, and then you can say to that role, I'm going to delegate some authorities to you, so you can maybe even create other roles. But those other roles that you create can't do certain things, right? So that's a permission boundary that you can start doing to delegate some authorities. Those are pretty fantastic. One of the ones I do like to point out here would be, when you are in our standard partition, there's like commercial, so US East 1, US West 2, and all that kind of stuff, right? When you go in IAM, you go inside of that account, you can use, and you have EC2 star or S3 star, let's say, you can then create a bucket in any region in the world, right? The 18 plus regions that we have. Well, some of my customers, they only want to operate in the US, let's say. So how can I do that? How can I limit that you can only use certain regions? You can do that a couple ways, but one of the cool ways to do it was actually with a permission boundary. So you can say, I'm going to put this permission boundary to say that you can't do anything unless it's in certain regions. And then you apply normal policies to that role or user. And even if that policy is star, they won't be able to do anything in London or Frankfurt or Sydney or anything else, right? So permission boundaries are pretty powerful. It's one of the best ways to check and verify from a security perspective that roles or users are not going to be able to do things that you really don't want them to do. And service control policies are very similar to permission boundaries. By show of hands, who's using organizations, AWS organizations, yeah? Just a few. I would definitely check that out. I'm not going to dive too much into organizations at all today, but it is a nice way to actually kind of manage your multiple accounts. So SCPs, or service control policies, are very similar to a permission boundary. The difference here really is, or the way I like to think about it at least, is a permission boundary is applied to the specific IAM entity, like the role or the user, right? Whereas SCP, or service control policy, is applied to the account. So it's at a higher level. So no matter what role you are, the SCP will apply to you. So With IAM, hopefully a lot of this is known by some folks, but if not, we'll cover it real quick. You have identities, you have the actions, everything you do inside of AWS is an API action, so you can then document out, hey, I want you to be able to take these actions against these resources. And the cool part here is conditions. Not a ton of my customers dive too deep into conditions, so I'm going to show you some examples of those in a minute. Not even a minute, maybe a few seconds. So in this particular case, we have a statement that says, hey, I'm going to allow you to attach and detach volumes to EC2 instances, any instance that you want, but with the condition that there has to be a tag called department and the value is dev. So if that system is not tagged dev or key value of department dev, then you cannot attach and detach volumes. Right? So you can use conditions for a whole slew of different things. That's just an example. But this is another way I would say to dive deeper into your roles and the policies that you have for a system that you have ATO with, and really understand what can they do, or what is it that you don't want them to do, and are you appropriately using conditions? This is just an example. Another one here, slightly different approach. This is with a resource policy. How many folks are really aware that we have IAM policies, and then we also have this other thing called resource policies, right? Yeah, most commonly is the S3, that's why I put this one up here. But we have other resource policies. A KMS key policy, that's one. We also have VPC endpoint policies, that's another one. By default, by the way, if you're gonna say use the VPC or the S3 one, right? The S3 VPC endpoint, you're gonna drop that in, and that's gonna say like, hey, if I'm gonna use S3, it's gonna go through this endpoint. Did you know that had a resource policy? By default, it's set to ***. But you can change that. You can update that to say, you can only go to this bucket, or buckets, if you will, or buckets only owned by this account, something to that effect. So think about this for a moment. Let's say I put in that VPC endpoint for S3, and you're like, hey, I'm more secure, and I think you are, because you're not gonna have to go out on IGW or out to the internet to hit that public API endpoint. So you're like, great, yay. And I have maybe permission boundaries, so I can only use buckets in the US or something like that. So you're like, all right, that's cool. But I didn't specify in my IAM policy I can only use certain buckets. It's really just S3, and I'm forcing all that S3 traffic through this VPC endpoint. But let's say I'm a bad guy and I'm internal and I'm doing exfiltration, right? That VPC endpoint policy is to S3 *. So I could create my own account, my own S3 bucket, and still use that VPC endpoint policy because it's not stopping me, right, to go to my own bucket that's in the same region. Or you can create a policy or leverage the policy on that VPC endpoint to say you can only go to these buckets. So you can close that door. Does that make sense? So SCPs, a little bit more about those. Two ways to think about it. One is whitelisting. So what services do you want people to use, right? And that's the kind of thing about SCPs and permission boundaries. It doesn't actually grant you to write the ability to use EC2 as an example, but if you don't list EC2, they can't do anything with EC2. So it's sort of setting that upper boundary, right? The maximum possibility of services they can use. So you do have to whitelist out some stuff. Now you could put ***, that's your upper boundary, and then you can just blacklist things, meaning you just put it in the explicit denies, right? But either way, where I would definitely think about whitelisting out some stuff and then also applying some blacklist, right? So you cannot possibly do something with, pick one out of random, lumberyard. Maybe your environment is never gonna do game development. There's no particular reason that they should ever do anything with lumberyard. So as an SCP or a permission boundary, you can just block that off. The cool part here is it cannot be overridden by local administrators. So even if you're ***, you can't override what's the SCP or permission boundary. For SCPs, it even applies to root in a lot of cases. So next is logging. I know a lot of my customers do a lot of logging. They're usually logging the systems, the applications, databases, and so on and so forth. And even a fair number, or most of my customers are even aware of CloudTrail. So that's great. But there's actually even other logs that you can collect out of AWS. What about S3 server access logs, right? What about ELB logs if you're using ELB? So those are a couple examples there. There's even other services that you're using may have additional logs that you have to then enable and then go collect, right? And so they could be of very keen interest. Another one really is in CloudTrail, you can turn on data events. So not just the management events, but data events. There's two options there, one's for S3 and then one's for Lambda. Config is a wonderful tool, a wonderful service. It's one of my favorites. That is, if you're familiar with ITIL, the CMDB, right? The configuration management database. So in a traditional world, a lot of times people would either manually enter in, the routers they have, the switches they have, or the servers they have, what's the name of the server, and so on, all this kind of information, and how does it relate to the other config items that they have. And they would do this on some periodic basis. They may even have agents deployed, or they may do ping sweeps, but as we know, agents may fail. Ping sweeps only happen whenever they happen, right? So your discovery of your environment only happens whenever you run that discovery. But with config, because it's tied in with the API calls, it's like that. So if you have EC2 instances coming and going, config will know that and know, for instance, what VPC it was on, what subnet it was on, how many ENIs it had, what volumes did it have, were those volumes encrypted or not? If they were encrypted, with what key were they encrypted? All that stuff is captured by config. It does capture stuff that comes and goes. So it's not just about what exists right now, but what did exist at some point in time. It has a nice, I don't have a slide for it, but it does have a nice calendar view. I've talked to a number of my customers about using that in relation to their CAB or CCB, their change advisory board. So you can do reviews like, hey, you said you were going to do this change at this time. Is that the changes you made? And was it at that time, right? Or why do we have these changes showing up in config when I don't have a corresponding CAB record or CCB record, right? CloudWatch, CloudWatch has a lot of cool stuff that a lot of my customers aren't particularly aware of. For instance, all your EC2, ELB, EBS volumes, S3, tons of metrics for free. You go in there, you can see all sorts of cool stuff. A lot of my customers think they have to deploy their own thing with their own agents and all that stuff. And you totally can, and that's great. There's a lot of cool products and partners that we have. But just by default, you do get some metrics right there. So I would definitely check those out. In addition to that, there's also CloudWatch logs and CloudWatch events. We're going to talk a little bit more about CloudWatch events later, but those are awesome. GuardDuty, by show of hands, who here is already using GuardDuty? Yeah, that's a good number. That's awesome. GuardDuty is like one of the fastest growing services that we have. So it's that intelligence threat detection. The coolest part about this is a lot of my customers think it's very network focused, and it does use VPC flow logs, which is one of those logs I didn't mention earlier, but is one of those Amazon logs that you should be collecting. But it does use VPC flow logs and also DNS records, so it is kind of network centric in that way, but it also uses CloudTrail. And CloudTrail is not necessarily network focused, right? So who's logging in, who's doing what actions are being taken, GuardDuty captures a lot of that info as well. So consolidating logging, so you have all these logs, you might have multiple accounts. The idea here is to pull all those together and then start doing something with that information. Some of the ones I bolded down here, again, were the things that not a lot of my customers are thinking about. VPC flow logs, server access logs, ELB logs, RDS logs, other logs, question. Just throwing it out there for you guys to think about it. If you're using an Amazon service, does it have a log? Or how are you getting that information? Now remember CloudTrail, a lot of people are like, oh, it's all in CloudTrail, it's all in CloudTrail. CloudTrail captures a ton of stuff. It absolutely does, and it's amazing. But it's generally control plane, or is what I call control plane. It's not data plane, right? So it's like with S3, CloudTrail says, who created a bucket? Who deleted a bucket? That's control plane. But who put an object in, who fetched an object out, that's data plane. That's not in CloudTrail. Makes sense? So you have to think about it at that level as well. Quick pause. I usually do these with people who can talk back and forth with me. It's kind of interesting. So, VPC flow log. Hopefully we have that enabled in all our VPCs. And we're collecting that, or those logs are getting generated. Quick fun fact, VPC flow logs used to always have to go to CloudWatch logs. Now you can drop them off into an S3 bucket and pull those into something else, so that's great. But in this case, we're going to have our mission application. It's going to be running in whatever VPC that we have. We're going to grab those flow logs. We're going to do into CloudWatch logs. And then we can start filtering once it's in CloudWatch, right? And say, hey, I just want to know SSH rejects, yeah? That port that's coming in, that's rejected or not. And if it's greater than 10, not just greater than 10, but greater than 10 over some period of time, right? So we can say, hey, it looks like somebody's really trying to do something to my system. Send me an alert. And then I can go over to Lambda and notify the SOC or system admins or whatever the case may be. But this is just a way to say, don't just collect the logs. That is certainly step one, but also start doing something with those logs, right? Automate the builds. So I really do think this is part of security. Part of the thought process of security is how are things being built in your environment. If it's manual, what I call clicky all around the screen, that's not reproducible very easily, right? What about a DR or COOP situation? 3 in the morning on Saturday, are you really going to be clicky in the console and think it's all going to be magical and work? Maybe, but probably not the best plan. So we can do something that's called infrastructure as code. How many folks in here are already using infrastructure as code in some form? Generally, maybe CloudFormation, right? So for those that are not yet believers, hopefully we can walk through it real quick. So I can build something, my test environment, my dev environment, that's in a different account, right? Because we already established we're going to do multiple accounts. And I can say, yeah, this is what I want. This is what I want my production environment to look like. If I did infrastructure as code, I can make it happen just like that. Or how many people have had things that are in production and are causing some problems and they want to reproduce that in their test lab? And that's never really works, yeah? I used to, before working with Amazon, I did work in another place with Physical World, and we had a little test lab. It was always kind of underfunded and we had the older stuff. And when we tried to replicate things, it wasn't always the same. But with infrastructure as code, I really could lift that up, drop it off, reconstitute it in a test environment, maybe have my other vendors come in and help me out to understand what is going on, what is going wrong. Effective for DR and COOP. If you want to have that same environment built somewhere else, like you want to take advantage of our multiple regions across the world, totally can do that. Allows you to automate validation. By this, I mean, you can do something like with CFN Lent or CFN NAG, which is by Stelligent, great partner of ours. And that's going to say, okay, cool, you wrote this template, this CloudFormation template. But before I deploy it, I wanted to automate testing or validation of it. I want to kind of interrogate that CloudFormation template and say, do you have a security group? And is that security group, or does that security group have, say, port 22 open to the world? If so, reject. Or do you have EC2 instances? Great. Are they tagged? Or something to that effect, right? Do you have this thing? Does it look like this? If not, reject. So you can automate that testing so you don't have to do it manually. It makes it much more uniform, and you can also then increase your security posture because nothing's going to get deployed in your environment unless it passes these hoops, right? And also for rollback, for change management. If you're doing infrastructure as code, you version things, you check them in, you have source control, you deploy it that way, right? You really treat it like code. This means if you want, you can roll back to a previous version. So that's pretty effective as well. So CloudFormation is generally how we at AWS will do infrastructure as code. You can do JSON or YAML formats. I would recommend YAML. Main reason, with YAML you can do comments. With JSON you can't put the comments in there, with YAML you can. I would also recommend to all of my customers to adopt some kind of style guide. To say, hey, if we're going to do YAML, we're going to do infrastructure as code, and we're going to do CloudFormation, we're going to build it out in YAML, great. What is that YAML supposed to look like? What is the order of things? In CloudFormation, there's no specific order in which you have to put the stuff. Like you can put outputs up first, and then resources, and then conditionals, and then whatever, parameters. But put it in the right order. Make sure that you have comments in there and that sort of stuff. And then CloudFormation will launch whatever it is that you told it to go build. One of the cool parts about CloudFormation as well is I may have a role that actually does not allow me to, let's say, create IAM stuff or even launch EC2, right? My role doesn't allow me to do that. But I have a CloudFormation template that's been like a golden architecture. I'm sure you guys are familiar with golden server images. So you can say, here's a pre-approved, already approved template that will launch a web server, maybe just a simple LAMP stack, right? Fantastic, but I don't have the rights to launch an EC2 instance, which means I can't launch that template. But with CloudFormation, you can actually pass it a role, and that role will launch the CloudFormation template on your behalf. So you don't actually have to give me the rights to launch an EC2 instance. I will never be able to go in the console and launch it. So if I want to launch that EC2 instance, I have to pass it the role to CloudFormation to make that happen. So that's a great way as well to kind of control your environment and make sure that it's exactly what you want it to be. People aren't going to do something different than you want it. So from a security perspective, I would say this is something I look for with my customers and talk about. Some examples. What I highlighted here are things that you can do. For instance, make sure encryption is there on this EC2 volume, or EBS volume, that it's tagged. And you can see those are really key factors, at least for me. Make sure you always tag things. Make sure you have a tagging strategy. This only has one tag, but you may have 5 or 6 tags. You can tag for security reasons. What kind of data is on here? What classification of data or data type is on there? You can have those as tags. What project team runs this, right? If it's an EC2 server, who's the sysadmin or what's that group? That sort of thing. Here's a longer version. This is a little bit more with security groups. One of the things I just wanted to point out here, I like this, that you can have security groups reference other security groups. This is better than referencing IP space, right? How many, by show of hands, were already familiar with that? Good number, great. And you can also reference security groups that exist in other accounts, right? So it doesn't have to even be in your own account, it just has to be a valid security group ID. Stack sets. So you're like, great, Steven, awesome, I'm a believer. I want to do infrastructure as code, I'm going to do all this stuff, and I have a standard set of roles because I'm going to do a federation and I'm going to assume standard set of roles in each account. And maybe I updated that. I already have 100 accounts now, or I have whatever number of accounts, more than just a handful. Now I have to go to each account and update CloudFormation, right, to introduce that new role. That can be tedious, but there's a new or different way you can do it too, and that's CloudFormation stack sets. So what you can see here, hopefully in this diagram, is that from one account, I can actually deploy to multiple accounts. Now, this gets a little bit into what we would call maybe governance at scale, right? How am I going to govern all my accounts at scale to make sure that those roles, in this case, I'm using roles as an example, but whatever the case may be, right? It could be route tables, security groups, whatever, that I want to deploy to multiple accounts without actually having to log into each account or assume a role in each account to deploy CloudFormation in each account, right? Are you well architected? Of course we are. So what is this about? We do have a well-architected framework. This framework has been developed over years. The whole point of this is to help you build faster, lower your risks, or mitigate a whole bunch of risks, make informed decisions, and really based on AWS best practices. How many folks in here have sat or worked with an AWS account team to do a well-architected review? Oh, that's great. That's great. Good number of you. So it is based on some pillars and design principles, and we ask questions that relate to those design principles for each pillar. These are the pillars: operational excellence, security, that's always a fun one, reliability, performance efficiency, and cost optimization. So security and reliability, I do like to focus in on quite a bit. Security seems like the obvious stuff, right? Are things encrypted? Are your security groups good or bad? Whatever. IAM roles, are you using users? Are you using MFA or not? All sorts of things we've already kind of talked about today. Reliability, though, is a little bit more on maybe your COOP strategy, your backup strategy. How many people are doing like snapshots or maybe making AMIs? Yeah, a lot of folks. Do you do that into a different account? Wait, so if your account's compromised, where are your backups? Oh no, right? I'm not saying your account will be compromised. It could be an internal thing, who knows, right? But the point here is you want to put your backups into another account. That's really the best practice, right? Because you don't take tapes, LTO tapes on-prem, and stick those tapes right on top of your server. That's not what you do, right? You usually ship those off somewhere else, that they're off-site. So when you take backups in the cloud, whether they're not snapshots or AMIs or whatever the case may be, you stick them into hopefully a different account, also maybe a different region, right? This is just in case. We do have a famous saying here at AWS, you know, design for failure. I'm not saying we are going to fail or anything like that, but you want to design for failure so if it does happen, you have a place to reconstitute your services. Performance efficiency, this really will dive into things like, hey, are you using CloudWatch metrics? So many of my customers are not necessarily looking at CloudWatch metrics, so if you're coming from an on-prem world, you may also be coming from this environment where I only can buy servers once every 3 to 5 years, so I'm just going to buy big, right? But in the AWS world, you can change that server size very easily and very quickly and save yourself a lot of money. What I like to describe is if, let's say I'm using an M4 2XL instance type, right? And if I go to an M4 XL, I just cut my price in half, literally in half. And most of my customers, the chunk of their costs are really from EC2 EBS, because that's kind of like they're going from a lift and shift model, right? This is kind of the world they know of. They haven't yet migrated necessarily to a whole bunch of containers or a whole bunch of functions yet. So if you're in that traditional kind of world, that kind of traditional kind of space, then a lot of your time is going to be with EC2 and EBS. So if you can cut that in half, that's great. How would I know I can? Well, look at the performance metrics that you get for free, right? Take a look at those. And that also then bleeds into cost optimization. So you can see how one pillar kind of runs into another. So we do now have a tool out there in the console, if you're in commercial space, that you can kind of answer some of these questions yourself. I would also say you can work with an account team, hopefully having a solutions architect, and they can come out and do a well-architected review for you. So the tool is going to be like you're going to answer it yourself, right? And of course, you probably pick all the right answers, yeah? Hopefully you're honest in your assessment and you can get some really good feedback that way. That's a great place to start. You can also, like I said, work with either solutions architects or even partners of ours. We do have a number of partners that have that competency that can come in and do a well-architected review in your space. So there's the pillar, the question, the context, and the best practices. So it gives you a whole bunch of information here. So I highly recommend that you go through that tool. And again, this is even from a security perspective, right? Is your environment actually built right? This is going to build out one. I like Venn diagrams. So I saw this thing and I was like, I got to have this. So there's a whole bunch of stuff with the Well-Architect. There's content, there's tools, and there's data. Inside of the content, the resources, videos, framework design principles, there's white papers galore. I know everyone likes to read white papers. I do. That's how I fall asleep. There are tools out there. We kind of talked about the one that's there now. We mentioned that self-service can also be with our partner or SA-led. If you have enterprise support, if you happen to have enterprise support, then you have a technical account manager. And if that's the case, then you can get a well-architected review. I think it's once a year with that particular account or service. So something to reach out to your technical account manager about. And the data itself, right? So there's a great report that gets as a result of this. And I've had a number of customers that do this and they end up making some of these things called POAMs. Maybe you're familiar with that, right? So they're gonna be like, all right, cool. So there's a whole bunch of findings. That doesn't mean, you know, shut it down, let's go home. It just means like, all right, there's things we can improve. So you can build it into maybe sprints and say over the next 4 weeks or whatever your sprint is, we're gonna improve these things. and then we're going to do it another one and another one and another one, right? The thing that I like to do when it's SA-led and I'm involved is actually have some folks from the security team with me, and as well as the sysadmins and stuff with me, so they can see why we're asking the questions, what are we actually looking for. So if they do the sprints and they start checking off all the things that we did, right, all the findings that we had, that they know exactly how to verify and validate that it's good. And this also means that because I'm just one person, I really can't come in and do, you know, 50 well-architected reviews in a week. So if the security assessors really start to understand this process, you can hopefully start to bake this inside of your own organization. Some more white papers available on Kindle. There's training. The report is awesome. Like I said, I have not had any customer say that it wasn't very helpful. So if you haven't done one already, I would definitely take a look at that. And the notes and the milestones kind of really relate to the fact that we're going to get to that kind of roadmap to success afterwards. Here we go. So this is kind of what it looks like in the console. And you see you have videos right there, some other information, probably links to the white papers and so on. This is what the report, the self-assessment report may look like. So it's really great. I would highly recommend that maybe even before you're in production, that you do this to your pre-prod environment, right? Your test or whatever it is right before you go to prod. Have them do a self-assessment, well-architected review and see how that looks. Oh no, I got 13 minutes. All right, so what's in summary? Isolate your workloads. Don't put everything in one account. Have multiple accounts. That's number one. Those accounts, not just for your different environments like test, dev, prod, that sort of thing. Certainly, absolutely do that, but also think about your backups, right? We kind of talked about that too. That should also be in a different account. Your security apparatus should be a different account. Some kind of shared service should be its own account, right? So think about what kind of accounts that you may need and start creating those. Really dive deep in IAM. That's the keys to the kingdom in a lot of ways, right? So what policies do you have? Are you using permission boundaries or SCPs? If not, maybe start taking a look at those. Are you really using conditionals inside of those policies, right? Based on tags or other kind of things. So really understand that. Another conditional could be, I had some that say, can you log in from the console from Starbucks? Or do I have to be on my corporate network to log into the console? That's a condition set that you can do inside of IAM. Or can I create a KMS key and delete a KMS key or schedule deletion for a KMS key without MFA? Or do I need MFA for that action, right? That's another condition that you can set. Make sure that you collect all of the logs, not just the logs that you've always known and loved, but really take a step back and say, in the AWS environment, what other logs are there? I'm using S3, great. There's S3 access logs. Do you know about them? What information can you get out of them? Why would they be interesting and useful, right? So dive into that. We mentioned a few of them here today, VPC flow logs, ELB logs, and so on. Use infrastructure as code. Absolutely do it. I have some customers that use Terraform. Fantastic, that's great. I think the real key here is that you're doing infrastructure as code. CloudFormation is a fantastic tool. It's free to use. The resources that build will cost you money, of course, but CloudFormation itself is free to use. Stack sets is pretty powerful. I think some other sessions here you may have already heard. Some new releases and feature sets that they're doing with CloudFormation, so it is a wonderful tool. There's a lot of video instruction out there on CloudFormation, how to get involved with that. I would say also, again, make sure you have a style guide, because people may come and go from your environment, right? So what does the CloudFormation template look like? Make sure you're using comments. And then the well-architected review. Make sure you're doing the self-assessments, because you can do those. Maybe engage your account team. If you have a very important workload, a mission-critical workload, have an SA-led one or a partner, AWS partner-led one to come in and do that. Well, I really can't take any questions, so I don't really have anything else to add to this, unfortunately. I guess I went too fast. We can go back maybe and look at my Venn diagram. So don't leave yet, because then it causes some panic. So, with my wonderful Venn diagram. Yeah, what I like to also up here, I did mention quite a bit about the improvement plans, which I think is really one of the key best values that people get out of well-architected reviews. But a couple other things I did fail to mention previously was Marketplace. How many folks are using Marketplace today? A fair number. Yeah, Marketplace is a great place to go to find additional security tools or services that you don't necessarily have to build yourself. They can come kind of pre-made, ready-baked. So those are great, especially if you're thinking about maybe doing something like, well, pre-transit gateway, which we have now, but pre-transit gateway, you might have to create a transit VPC to kind of control that network traffic going in and out, egress and ingress of your environment. So Marketplace was great to have some products and AMIs out there to let you control how that would work. Maybe they're Cisco or Palo Alto devices or appliances. So those are really cool. And other than that, I think I'm running out of tap dancing. Oh wait, I think you do have to fill out surveys. Make sure you say it was the best ever. Yeah. Finished early, so that's always fun. You get a few minutes back. Great. Leave discreetly. Thank you.